thing that I see with that, and don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-AI, but it has to be in balance. And we haven't yet found that balance, and we're still in early days. I don't want to get too far into that on this answer first, but so it can often do a fairly good first um, analysis, and maybe even a fairly good draft. And I, so I say fairly good. It is not an expert, and it's an algorithm that predicts the next logical set of language, the large language model. So if you rely on that solely, you're going to regret it, because it's deficient. It doesn't catch the nuances and doesn't understand the field. And how could it? It hasn't been in my place for over 40 years practicing. So use it judiciously. It can save you a lot of time and effort. I did for example, just recently, with no names attached. A client came in and wanted to do a demand letter, which often, the public calls them cease and desist letters. Someone that was infringing one of the, in this case, is the artwork of the client. So they had done a draft demand letter with AI. Then they brought it into me and they said, well, I think we should put this under a lawyer's letterhead. I said, makes sense to me. It's going to add more gravitas than coming from you as a client. And you don't really know, you're not a lawyer and you haven't been practicing the field. So it's probably a good idea. So I took the draft, and once again, I found the same thing. It was not bad, but it was deficient. There were some arguments missing, and it was not worded like a skilled lawyer or wordsmith in the field would do. It just wasn't. So if you're going to go up against senior counsel at a major corporation, you want to be on a more level playing field than you just representing yourself and having a deficient AI generated cease and desist letter. Sorry, doesn't work. It's not going to be nearly as effective. So that has yet to play out. But yeah, we get involved in that. That's quasi-litigious, for sure. And I'm hoping that that major corporation that arguably has infringed the copyright of my client will come to the table and do the right thing and pay a proper fee and stop infringing. But that's yet to be seen. So there's an example as a side note. So things I'd look out for: is it well worded? Is it full of typos? Lots of them are. We even see, and I really feel for a lot of the artists, but I'm glad they come here. I look at a lot of ones where they're out and out scams. Sad. Like, the artist has been out there applying their trade for years. They think they got a legitimate offer. Someone really, it's defrauding someone, really, or attempting to. They'll copy a logo. They'll make an offer. And often when I look at the offer, I'm going, okay, wait a minute. How many streams do you have? Where are you playing live? What have you done with your career? Why would someone offer you, for example, and this is out of real life, $250,000 to do what? And by the way, how old are you? Not that I want to be ageist, I don't. But often this is a very youth-oriented business. So if you're working with a major label, they're probably going to be looking at someone under 25. Just saying. Not saying you can't have a career if you're older than that. That's not what I'm saying. Not at all. But when you look at the credibility of the offer and going, this makes no sense. It makes no sense at all. And there are other parts to that deal. But has that happened? Yes. 3 or 4 times over the last year. And regrettably, we're all vulnerable on the web to those types of situations. So I'm actually grateful that those would-be clients, because they didn't become clients. I just looked at the deal and said, I can't act for you on this. I don't think it's a real deal. And probably save them from being defrauded. I even had one situation where they wanted to meet in person and wanted the artist to bring their passport. What? No label is going to ask you for your passport. You can see where that's going. Identity theft, big time. But that's on the extreme. Does it happen? Yes. It has happened more frequently than I like, but I'm happy when someone comes and I can, you know, burst that balloon. I don't feel good for the artist perspective because lots of artists want a leg up. I get it. It's hard out there. You're wearing 12 different hats. You're your own tour manager, your own songwriter, your own producer, often, your own manager, your own choreographer, your own booking agent. Oh yeah, you got to perform. Oh, by the way, we need to promote on social media. The list goes on. Every one of those could be a full-time job. That's insane. That's what you're wearing. Those hats you're wearing as an independent artist. I know. I still play in a band. I know. I do know. I know it on both sides of the desk. By the way, I still have fun playing, by the way. I want to make that clear. And that's why I do it. It's the balance in my life, right? The arts and the law. One allows me to do the other and make a living and support my family and have a modest lifestyle. Um, so other red flags, the lack of an accounting and audit clause. That's a real sign of what I call bad faith. And that's a term of art in the legal field. But if you're on royalty based and someone doesn't give you an accounting or an audit clause, doesn't that sound like they're not going to pay you? Doesn't that sound like they don't want you to know what they received and what you should be earning and paid out and verified? I think so. So that always sticks in my craw when I see that, especially if it's coming from other side counsel, because I'm going, wait a minute, you're trying to take advantage of my client. And that's just a low blow and a cheap shot that already starts to feel like bad faith and creates distrust. Sorry, that's not a great way to start. No, most agreements do are have a kind of a, well, you could use the word lowball first offer, an introductory level, and you're expected to, in this industry, negotiate it and try and find somewhere between the high and low on their side and the high and low on your side, and it meets in the middle. You got a deal. Great, it's good for both, presumably, right? But you don't know that. So a lot of times the trick is, oh, well, it's just a standard agreement, sign it. We don't negotiate it. That's nonsense. That's not the way the industry works. Now, I'm saying there are more certain companies and certain countries in the world that have practices that are different than what we do. But certainly in North America, you are not expected to sign that first draft. You're expected to go and get proper counsel. That protects the other side too, whether it be a record label or a manager, and it protects you. You know what you're signing, and they know that you know what they're signing, and you can't come back later and say, I didn't understand it. I didn't have a lawyer. Not a good argument, by the way, in a court. It is an argument, but not necessarily a winning one. So better to lawyer up, so to speak, and protect your interest. Why not? You know? And I'm asking that rhetorically, of course. Sometimes it's a matter of cost, that's hence alas. At least get some basic advice on it and figure out where you might want to go from there. So, I mean, there's many, many red flags, but the quality of the drafting, if it's riddled with typos and it looks like it was cobbled together, probably was. I'm not saying you can't do your own agreements, but some people are more skillful and adept at that than others. And if that you're not that way oriented, then doesn't it make sense to get help? I use this analogy. Guess what? I don't fix my car, right? I don't do my dental work either. I go to a professional. So why shouldn't you? You should. It makes sense. And the other thing that you get, if you do go to a lawyer, you get it's very intangible. That's true. It's legal advice. So other than the paperwork that you see or the emails that go back and forth or the multiple drafts, which often take place when you're entering into contracts and contract negotiation, really at the end of the day, you owe it to yourself. And you can say, look, I did my best. I treated the offer seriously. We made some counter offers, which is often the case, suggested revisions and amendments, and I got the best deal I could. That is called peace of mind, and that's the best you can do. You never really know when you enter into a contract. It's all about relationships. That's what a lot of people don't understand. Yes, it's a commercial document. Yes, there's money changing hands usually, right? Unless it's a barter relationship, which can still be a binding contract, by the way. But at the end of the day, behind that, there's usually the people. Do you like to work with them? Do you trust them? Do they do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it? I know that sounds so commonsensical, and it is, but we lose that common sense. So that's the first thing I ask when someone wants to terminate a relationship, particularly a management relationship. My first question is, how far gone is this relationship? Is it still valuable to you? Should we try and um, salvage it, rebuild the trust? If not, then fine. We'll take a hard line and we'll find a way to either find a loophole in the contract, which is possible sometimes, not always, and or negotiate some type of settlement to get out of the deal. So that's another thing you would look at in a deal. You obviously want to know how long it lasts, what you're going to be paid, and if it isn't working out, how can I terminate? Or even if it is, how long will it last? If it's it runs the course of the term of the agreement. Very common, really important terms, basic ones. But I think a lot of times, what a lot of people forget is the basics apply. I apply the basics every day here. Every file I open. But what are the basics? Well, um, is it a contract at all? I mean, is there an offer? Is there an acceptance of that offer? Is there proper consideration? Consideration is a legal concept that's much broader than just the money changing hands. It can be things like credit on a record. It can be uh, value for value's worth, where you speculated time as a producer, and in return you get credit on a record, for example. That's a barter relationship. Still consideration, and it could be any combination of those. Anything of value changing hands under that agreement. So I look at that, especially when there's maybe a situation where it's a partly oral, partly written agreement. The first thing you ask is there a contract there at all? Is there something that's binding or not? Or can you make the argument there never was a contract, so there's nothing to get out of, right? All of that is part of, you learn, right? And you apply. So I'm probably off topic there. You can go to the next question if you like.
Well, going back to, or I guess building off of that, what are rookie mistakes people make or false assumptions when it comes to entertainment law?
Well, I think they think it's all glamour all the time. And I joke about it. Um, yes, there is that element to it. And yes, it's fun to go down to a client of mine that's performing at Massey Hall, for example, and hang backstage with them. That's great. It's not so glamorous to be there at 2 a.m. in a bar when there's no one there, and you're still doing the the client service, if you will. So I joke about it. I say, I'm in the fluorescent light, so my clients could be in the limelight. So we're in the back room. We're part of the team. We're not on stage, but we're making their time on stage hopefully be most valuable for them and as problem free as you can get. So yeah, that if you like that, um, and it's long hours, probably work well 11:30 every night, and I read a lot to try and keep up. It's a very fast paced business. Um, on the other hand, as a sole practitioner, I do have a fair amount of control over my hours. Not always, because some certain time sensitive things come up with clients, and I have to be there. I mean, just this week, um, it was Tuesday night. I got a contract in about 6 o'clock. I'm heading home. Um, we need it right away. I started work on that about 10 o'clock at night. Finished it about 11:30. Set the appointment up yesterday. Spent an hour on the phone with the client to get them to the next level. That's anything but glamorous, but it's a good client. So why wouldn't I do that? Right? Is that fairly common? Yeah. I try and be proactive though. I try and be 2 steps ahead of the game, because otherwise you're going to always be what's called crisis managed. Not fun. Don't want to be there. I want to be ahead of that. So, and you can take this to the bank too, because you learn this as you're in a service industry. That's what law is. We're not the only one. We're just like any other service industry. So what you want to do is under promise and over deliver. I'll give you an example. Client says, when can you have that? And again, this is just a hypothetical example. I'll say, I got it in 2 weeks. I'll get you in 2 weeks. Okay, great. They're expecting that in 2 weeks. I deliver it to them in a week. Oh, hero. Now let's turn that the other way around. I can get you that in a week, but I give it to you in 2 weeks. Ah, I overpromised and underdelivered. I don't do that. I just don't do it. And if I got myself in a jam, I put that time sensitive matter to the forefront and deliver. Why? Because I need the trust of my clients. They need to believe me when I say I'm going to do what I say I'm going to do. And that's no different with any other relationship. It doesn't matter whether it's a personal relationship or matters an awful lot with a personal management agreement. If your manager keeps hyping you and under delivering, you're very soon going to not believe anything they say. Same thing with the lawyer. So I try not to do that. And so far, you know, and that doesn't matter whether I'm sick, I don't want to do it, or I'm tired, I do it. I have to do it, right? I don't take on the file. So misconceptions about entertainment law. Hopefully I haven't deflated your the balloon or burst that bubble. Hey, it can be fun too. It's fast paced. If you like contracts, it's usually, I consider entertainment contracts mostly. Yeah, the other, like I said, the intellectual property, trademark, corporate law goes with it. But I would say still, by and large, it's a commercial field, right? Commercial meaning agreements dealing with money. Because yes, there are creative elements to a publishing agreement or a recording agreement, absolutely. But at the end of the day, it's still a commercial document where money's changing hands and someone's to get paid, usually a royalty or net receipts, whatever. So I think that's, I'm going to point you to something. There's an article on my website, Sanderson Entertainment Law, that's entitled. I think it was published in the Law Times. You could look under the I wrote the book section under my bio section, and it says 30 years of entertainment law. What have I learned? And you can get a little more insight from that article that was written for the. I didn't write it. I was interviewed for the Law Times, so which is a legal publication for lawyers to keep up on the law, etc. By the way, I do keep up on general law, but I also every day I read probably half a dozen different newsletters and blogs. I subscribe to Billboard. I have like for decades, and I read Billboard Canada. I read Billboard US. I read Music Business World, which is out of the UK. So we've got a Canadian, US, and UK perspective, and they're often, since it's in a global industry and always has been, you also get articles from that maybe from Australia or Europe that will give you some idea what may be happening in terms of uh, the music industry in those jurisdictions and copyright issues, which are relevant too. So reading every day, I think maybe an hour a day of just to keep it on that developments in the industry. I also read some, Canadian lawyer website. I subscribe to some other larger law firms newsletters that have IP issues. Anything to pull it together, right? To keep up. It is, like I said, it's a very fast-paced field, and it changes very quickly. Uh, and as you might guess, a lot of legal issues now surrounding the development and the legal aspects of AI that's developing rapidly, just as the technology is and the use of it. So you got to stay up on that. So anything, well, I think you kind of make your practice what you want to make it, right? So if you want to hang with musicians, you'll probably do music. If you want to be more of the film side, you'll probably be with film. Book publishing, same thing. You'll find that I think each genre or each field attracts a certain type of person. And I think clients pick on the fact that you are attuned to their world. Do you have to be? No, you don't. You can still be a really good lawyer and not, not hang with them or know much about music at all. But I don't think it hurts. And I think in the long run, it gives you that extra staying power because it's not an easy gig on either side of this desk. Believe me, it is not. It's extremely challenging for both. And I'll give you an example. When I first started practicing, there's maybe a half a dozen lawyers in this country that knew anything about music law. I was one of them. I can name you at least several dozen or more in Toronto alone that claim to do entertainment law. Think about it. It's incredibly competitive, and it seems to be a field where people think it's easier. And I use that quotes. That's a misconception. That it's not like law. It is. I mean, I'm a lawyer. That's how I make my living. It just happens to be in that specialty field of arts and entertainment. So I think those are misconceptions. And, if you find grinding out contracts, because that's basically what it is, day after day, glamorous, then it's glamorous. But you kind of pick your own perks too. But you need to be in balance because if you're, when you're in private practice, you have an administrative burden with the law society, billings and collections, trust accounts, etc. Client work, right, and then promotion. So the client promotion is, I think, the side that people find the most interesting that you can hang out with a name artist, or be with them at their venues or whatever, their shows. And yeah, that's cool. Yeah, if you like that, sure, you can seek that out. But just remember, you got to be in the office the next day and still having to pay your rent. So you can't do too much of that. These things need to be in balance. I guess that's enough for that question. I don't know.
Um, this is personally out of my own personal curiosity. How can artists protect themselves and their trademarks and IP in the age of AI? So whether that be their
Sorry, just a little low there, Emily. Could you repeat that?
sorry, how can artists protect themselves, their trademarks and their IPs in the age of AI? So whether this be AI companies using their music to like generate new music, or I guess just how can artists protect themselves now that technology is changing?
Well, remember what I said earlier, the basics apply. One of the best things you can possibly do with your copyrights is register them. Do you have to? No, you don't. But if you want that extra level of presumption of ownership, register your copyrights. And by the way, it's a territorially based system. So if you want protection in Canada, you register with CIPO in Canada. You register with the US Copyright Office in the US for extra level of protection. And our copyright acts, even though there's some commonalities, they're different. And you can't assume that just because you're registered in Canada, you get the same protection for that Canadian registration in the States. You don't. So you do it country by country. Secondly, protect your trademarks, register them to the extent they're valuable to you. And once again, you get even more protection from a trademark. It's beyond just the presumption of ownership that's rebuttable, which means it can be overturned. You actually get exclusive rights to that slogan or logo or name or trademark or trade name once you register it, and that applies nationally throughout the country. But remember, it always has been a global industry, so it gets expensive registering and protecting your copyrights and trademarks. Primarily, that's what you'd be looking at worldwide. Um, so, in some ways, I don't know if you can protect yourself completely unless you didn't expose it on the web or publicly at all, which makes no sense because that's how you make money from it. And you do want it out there. As an artist, you do want to share your works. Of course you do. Absolutely. So you're going to be at some vulnerability, but at very least, put the copyright notice on, which is a C within a circle, or copyright in full, the name of the copyright owner, which in this case will likely be you, the artist, and the year of publication. It's not the year of creation, but the year it actually has been released. Same thing with trademarks. Use the TM symbol to indicate you're claiming trademarks in that particular trademark. And now, I want to make it really clear. Those are not mandatory. Those are strictly voluntary, but those are very good practices to keep in mind. One of the problems is, and like I said, it's early days. We're in the process of what I call a 3L process. Litigation. I think right now there's probably around 100 lawsuits in the US alone, a handful here in Canada that's trying to establish whether or not, and these are technical legal words, but you can look them up on the web. You can even take a quick look at Wikipedia. Fair use in the States, fair dealing in Canada. So that, and I'm probably being overly simplistic here, but the AI companies are saying, well, we sampled everything on a mass scale, but we never really copied anything directly. We simply used that to train our models to make new works. So we're making the argument, or that's their position, that this is either fair dealing or fair use in the States, fair dealing in Canada. And some of the cases so far is, and it takes a while to get um, cases through court, especially if you're going up to the Supreme Court of Canada or the US, that can take you 10 years. Well, technology races ahead, right? So litigation, legislation, we now have an AI minister, Evan Solomon, at the federal level, who's working on policy. Whether they'll come up with some legislation soon, don't know. And the other thing that is happening is licensing. So those are all happening. That's probably the quickest and the most certain. And you've been seeing, in fact, I was just reading that this morning. Once again, often well-known celebrity artists, often actors, have valuable voices, and they've been licensing that voice to an AI company that could clone them and use it in various situations that they approve. Right, so that's happening too. It's going to take a while to sort this out, as with any other technological change, which we've gone through many. Think about it. You go back historically when I started practicing, believe it or not, vinyl records with a dominant sound carrier configuration. No internet. Then it moves over to cassettes. Then it moves over to CDs for many years. Then along comes Napster, right? Bang, file sharing. That's a huge disruption that caused double-digit declines on the record side until they came up with a little thing called iTunes, and now, of course, streaming. Each one of those has caused disruption in the industry and legal issues, right? So AI is no different that way. It's just way more prevalent, and it is a game changer. There's no question about that. Where we will sit in terms of the equilibrium of rights and use and access, I don't know yet, and no one knows. It's ongoing. It's being developed. Like I said, it's remarkably and fairly early times with AI. So I think you're still vulnerable, but like I said, apply the basics. You want to protect it, register your works, copyright, trademark. Um, if it's something confidential, try and enter into so-called NDAs or non-disclosure agreements. If it really is something you don't want access, then keep it private. Keep it on a private, password coded site. But I think we're all vulnerable in that, and that's actually the major record labels. Every one of them has been cutting deals with AI, and the artists are getting some compensation, but they've done that kind of en masse. So if you're with a label, they may have already cut a deal. But I think in that case, you'd want some contractual approval if you can acquire that through negotiation, so that AI is either approved or not approved, right? Disapproved. No, you can't do that. So I'm still, like I said, the basics are still in intellectual property law, which is the infrastructure of this industry, copyright, trademarks, and also industrial designs and patents for various other reasons. And then the contracts, which tend to be, it's almost like the infrastructure. The foundation is the IP, and the contracts are the walls and the roof on this structure. And I could get more technical about it, but most of those contracts are either by way of assignment, where you're transferring rights and ownership, often to copyright or trademarks, and licenses, the consent to use. We've been talking about a lot of licenses here, because that assumes that you still own your rights, or the label owns your rights, whoever it may be, and then deals with a third party that gives them permission to do something that, in the absence of that, they don't have the right to do. So that's a contract. They're both contracts, assignments and licenses. That's how the industry works. Those are the building blocks. So those will always apply. They're not going to go away. And I truly think that in the long run, um, in the interest of humanity and worldwide economics, we have to find a happy medium. You can't just literally take a millennia worth of work and turn it into AI and not compensate people. That does not make sense to me. I don't care whether it's fair use or fair dealing arguments. There has to be some happy medium there. Otherwise, it's like they say, you're killing the fatted goose, right? Artists are already struggling enough. Do you really want to take their livelihood away and have no incentive for creating new works? I don't think so. So there has to be some happy medium. We don't know what it is yet, but it's early days. So I believe there will be some, like I said, legal and ethical and economical equilibrium. It has to be. Otherwise AI has the possibility of destroying world economies, doesn't it? Do you want 40% unemployment? I don't think so. So how are we going to work with this? And again, I'm not an economist. That's just me conjecturing. So you can take from it what it's worth. But legally, I do think there has to be, yeah, I think the world equilibrium is right. It's not going to go away. We're going to have to work with it for good and not so good. And every time there's change, there's a plus and there's a minus. There's winners and there's losers. That's just the universal rule. That's not going to change. And change is the only constant. So we will continue to change. Who knows what will be next? We're just grappling this one now. I don't work in Silicon Valley, and I'm not a computer scientist. I can only guess. Anyway, I should move on to the next question.
This will be our final question before we open it up to the floor. As someone who has practiced in not only Canada, but the US, East Asia, as well as Europe, what do you think are the big cultural differences in entertainment law and in contracts in general, especially between Canada, the US, and I guess internationally?
Good question. Now, I haven't practiced in those areas. I have done licensing deals, and I've worked with Canadians doing, for example, a license deal in Japan or in Europe, Australia, US, yes, or record deals for sure. So just make that clear. I'm licensed to practice here in Ontario and insured to practice throughout Canada under Canadian law. So I've dealt with a number of Americans that have Canadian issues. Yes, that's true. But you do see the cultural differences, and you do start seeing some of the practices different in the field. For example, a contract out of Nashville is not going to look like the same type of contract out of Toronto with a record label, for example. You're going to be dealing with conflicts of law, and in most cases where, let's say, for example, there's an offer to license your music to sell into Japan, um, or New York, or whatever, the governing law will likely be that of probably Japan and Tokyo. That's just the way it is, right? So you need to understand that when it comes to enforcing that, you'll likely be in the jurisdiction where that contract is most closely associated. What I've seen over the years, and these are just a few idiosyncrasies that come up, in particular when we're dealing with Germany or Japan, especially in the CD era, the can I say that the pricing in Europe was much higher than in here in North America. That you might have been charged, say, let's say, the equivalent of 20 euros, not $20. Well, that's worth a lot more than, it could be 30 or $40. Uh, in Japan, in order to help, shall I say, offset some of the piracy and to make it clear that it was a legitimate license to a Japanese company, you would often have to add a bonus track so that it distinguished itself from um, another license that might have gone in some other part of the world. One time I was dealing with songwriter who was a client of mine that had a hit in South Korea with the K-pop phenomena, and their practices regarding copyrights were quite different. And there was an argument as to copyright ownership. And I'm going, well, my client wrote it. Yeah, well, we expect to be parceled in, and if you don't do that, we're not going to be dealing with you again to do further business. Same thing in Nashville, for example. There's a Nashville rule in songwriting, which we don't apply here. Here, when you're songwriting, you either contributed to the melody or lyrics or you didn't. Nashville, they have professional writers' rooms. Not that we don't have here too, but there's a music factory going on there, right? Especially for the country field, which has diminished somewhat, but it's still, there are songwriters that do nothing but songwriting in Nashville all day, every day. So if you're on a writing session there and you contributed nothing, you may still be attributed a share of that copyright. So the rough rule of thumb there is, in for a word, like one word out of a, say, maybe 80 words out of a pop song, in for a word, in for a third. So assuming there's three writers in the room, you contributed one word. That's unusual. That's a Nashville phenomenon. Doesn't apply here. We negotiate based on what you actually contributed. You don't necessarily weigh it by the kilogram, but you try and get try and do it as equally and fairly as possible. But if someone came up with all the lyrics and you came up with nothing and you were in the same writing room, too bad, you didn't write. That's our mentality here in Toronto, right? So there's a few examples. Those are kind of quirky. Yeah, so there are industry practices that will vary, but I want to emphasize there is a certain commonality. If you see a record deal out of a particular country or a license for recordings or a sub-publishing deal, you're going to see very similar language. And thankfully, that's the case. So those contracts have a fairly global set of language or jargon that's specific to the music industry. That's true. So that allows me to go, okay, well, what are the nuances? What do we need to be sensitive about? Because the other basics are going to be the same, right? What rights are being transferred? What are you being paid for that? Is there an advance against royalties? Are the splits more or less what we expect here for a co-publishing or a record deal or production deal? And they often are. Now, those are negotiable. Remember, you don't get what you deserve. You get what you negotiate. In fact, that's one thing I want you to take away. If you remember nothing from this workshop, you get what you negotiate, not what you deserve. Number two, get it in writing, right? And number three, check the facts. In fact, I would often say to my clients, not clients, students out at Metalworks, some of which became clients, but my students at Metalworks would say, look, you've got me here for this duration of a year. Ask what you want now, because after that, if you ever come to me, I'm in private practice. That's how I make my living. I'm going to ask for a retainer, and I'm going to want to be paid. Here, I'm working as a teacher. Ask away. And I said, this is what I've observed. the most major mistake of all that any of you there could make, and I make it on myself, but you need to stick your hand up, check your assumptions, and get the facts. If you do not, you will be probably penalized, and you will bear the consequences of that decision not to. I'll give you an example. 3 examples. No names attached. All true. All true. Client comes in, spends $60,000, mortgages their home to do an album. Is that good, bad, indifferent? I don't know. They'd already done it. No one thought to check whether the music was potentially commercial or might have success. I'm not here to judge. If you want to do that with your asset, your home, go for it. But maybe it would make a little sense first to figure out how you might recoup that money. Okay, next scenario. And they all get worse. They only get worse. Client gets signed to a production company. This is in the analog era. $250,000. Guess what? The artist can't sing. They look great. They had to punch in the vocals pre-Pro Tools era, syllable by syllable. Is that a good investment? I don't know. You might have checked whether the artist could sing, because yeah, that's a pretty valuable asset. Looking good is good, but looking good and singing good is even better. Number three. This one takes the cake. A client had spent $1 million, and this is back probably in the early, maybe late 1990s, early 2000s. $1 million. Comes to us and said, hey, we want you to be able to maybe help us to solicit this material and see if there's any interest in it. And I listened to it, and the office listened to it. I had a bigger office then. And it was like, why would you invest in an artist like this? Like, there was no obvious commercial potential at all. So the assumption there that you should have checked, I think, was to go to the industry first and say, why don't you do a little demo or something and let us hear it and maybe help? Never did. So check your assumptions, or you will probably be unpleasantly surprised at some point. Sometimes your assumptions are right, but often they're not. So yeah, I think that's really good advice. And you'd be surprised. A lot of people in this industry like to mentor, like to give back. They like to help someone who's going on the way up. They're giving back. It's like they say, it's just like paying it forward. So be surprised. Stick your hand up, ask for some advice. Someone might be more than happy to speak to you. Hey, what's the worst they can say? No? Okay, go to the next one that does. Big deal. If you can't stand the word no, you're in the wrong industry. This is an industry built on no's. Let's go way back. Let's go back to the Beatles. Every single record label passed on that act. Everyone. They went to like 20 different labels. They finally go to George Martin, the famous producer who became their pretty much lifelong producer. A comedy label, Parlophone, a sub-label of EMI, and threw them the worst offer from the bottom of the drawer. But they got their foot in the door. And then they just, they were tenacious. They hung on until they got a deal, and the rest is history. But yeah, everyone passed. So they had to accept a lot of no's. And so don't assume they just walked in and everything was golden, because it doesn't work that way. That's not what life's like. You pay your dues, and you never stop paying your dues, especially if you're a musician. You just don't. It's the way it is. Or a lawyer, for that matter. You're only as good as your last case, right? Anyway, you can pass on to the next question or open it to the floor, or I can keep rambling.
I think I think we have time to have one or two more questions. Are there any questions on the floor right now? Can give them like a minute or two to type into the chat. If
Yeah,
not,
thank you for
I'm
putting those references in the chat. Yeah, I just see that last Ontario, SIPO, USA. Yeah, great.
gonna say if not, I have questions prepped.
Yeah, well, fire away. I joke about it, but I don't take the money and run, Emily. I'm glad you laughed.
Yeah, let's wait. Let's wait to see if the artists have any questions.
I remember going to see the Rolling Stones once, down at Maple Leaf Gardens, which is no longer there. And I was so ticked off. After an hour and 15 minutes, you could set your watch. They took, they ran off the stage. And for years later, I went, that's taking the money and run. They usually get an encore, right? Especially of an artist of that stature. And then I realized it took decades later. I've been reading some of the, music industry articles. They used to judge the vulnerability of the stage from how high it was, right? And if it was too low, they would literally run off to probably their private Lear jets because of safety reasons. But you can understand me, a young fan, going, "Yeah, but it doesn't look like that to me. I wish someone had explained that." So I always felt they had taken the money and ran, but maybe there was security issues there. I don't know. I'm just saying.
Everett seems to have a question. Speaking of taking the money and running, are there
Yeah.
any common red flags to look out for in predatory record deals?
Well, I touched on some of them. Yeah, I think overly long terms, unfair royalty splits, um, way too long a commitment, uh, not budgeting. I mean, that's one thing for sure. Um, you want to be able to make a record for a reasonable budget, and you want to advance against royalties to the extent they can pay. Um, yeah, no obligation to release the record that you've done. All these are negotiable issues, of course, and you can make them better. Um, but if they're going to be a predatory company, it may be just something to avoid, because no matter what you do, even if you get a great deal, if they're not going to deliver on it, then you've signed a deal that you're now looking, unfortunately, to get out of. So the lack of accounting and audits, of course, I mentioned that earlier. Um, I think in some cases as well, we're in the era of what they call 360-degree deals or multi-rights deals. Multi-rights being recording, publishing, merchandising, often including endorsements, and live. So those uh, four quadrants, of which are the main revenue sources in the industry, um, if they're just taking rights for the sake of taking them and not exploiting them, I think that can be considered predatory. Um, but you want to be careful, because it, that it depends to what extent and what percentage, and what are they also bringing something else to the table. That company may also be your manager, which is not uncommon. In fact, it's been a very common business model in the Canadian music industry for years. That, um, for example, a company like Anthem Records, which was just recently sold, which originally signed Rush and was co-owned by Rush, always had management and all those other rights. And the only thing they didn't do was a booking agency. Didn't matter whether it was True North. They had publishing and recording. Guys like Bruce Coburn were signed to that label. Network Records in the early days with Sarah McLachlan managed, and of course had publishing and recording rights. So those aren't necessarily bad. They just have to be balanced. And if it's a good team and a good fit, it might actually work. So I think you need to look at each one carefully and then find out whether or not it's a good fit. And if it's not, can you make it better? And if not, then you should probably pass on it. We're in the age where now you really don't have to do a deal. Now, I can see why we want to, because you want a partner. And I use that loosely because they're not partners per se, but you want someone to help you with your career and take some of the load off in return for, hopefully a fair deal in relation to that, or at least an industry standard deal. I often say that there isn't really any fair deal per se, and I'm being a bit of tongue in cheek on that. There are fairer deals, there are better deals. There are deals that are consistent with industry customs. Does that make them fair? Not necessarily. Why? Because the risk in the music industry is high. It's always been about a 90% failure rate. So that means 10% of those records are pulling around are pulling the financial weight of all the other 9 that didn't make money or that barely broke even. So, so I want to be careful. Fair is a very kind of, we all want that, but does it really exist? I just say I can probably help you get a better deal, and it certainly makes sure it's within industry customs and therefore acceptable that way. I think as well, if you're looking at predatory record deals, I think you need to look at the backgrounds, the bios, the reputations of the principals that run it. So if you already know that they're not going to be dealing fairly, and you often know that through the field because other musicians have dealt with them, then you may want to stay away from that. I think that's another issue. Do you want me to go on to the next question there, Emily?
Yes. I have one more before we
Yeah.
wrap up at 150. So what happens if you mess up a contract? Yeah, what happens if you mess up a contract? Like you don't deliver on a section of your contract. This can be an artist or another member of the industry.
Okay, let's assume now from the artist's perspective, you didn't deliver. Let's say, and just use some common examples. You need to deliver an album every option period and every term, and you didn't. What can happen? Often in those contracts, there's what's called a suspension, right, or an extension. A suspension will then put that term, stop it from running until you do deliver, or extend your contract for an indefinite period of time, unless otherwise negotiated that it's a fixed term, till you do deliver. Now, you can't be forced under a personal service agreement, in which these are. It's not like you're hiring an electrician or a plumber. You're hiring an artist, and only that artist can provide those services. That's the very definition of a personal services agreement. That's a legal term of art. You can look it up. But only that artist can provide those services. So you can't substitute, Madonna for the Rolling Stones or whoever. It's not going to happen. There's only one Madonna, there's only one Rolling Stones, et cetera, et cetera. Every artist is unique. Every artist. Doesn't matter whether they're famous or not. Every artist is unique. So they could end up suing you for not so much for what they call specific performance, which means you have to go in and record that record. No, because if you did, it would likely sound terrible because you're doing it against your will. But they will allow the exclusivity to be litigated, and if you don't deliver, you could be suffering you could be subject to a lawsuit for damages. Damages are monetary, um, um, a monetary award, money in essence. So whatever it cost them to, because you didn't deliver, that will be on your tab, and you could be sued for that. Or you may just be simply dropped. It depends. A lot depends on the party you're dealing with, how valuable the artist is, what their track record is, et cetera, et cetera. All those factors have to be factored in. So I'm not sure that's clear from an artist perspective. You have some liabilities there potentially. Hopefully you'll work it out, but maybe not, and maybe mutual ideas to not continue, and maybe that's a mutual agreement, or maybe you'll get released, but there may be what's called a contractual override for the next deal, or a set of revenue that you would be entitled to. For example, under a new record deal, if the old one's terminated. Um, this can be as an artist, yes. We would talk about, or another member of the industry. I'm not sure what that means. I guess it is possible that the label um, defaulted. There's often a bit of a, shall I say, a safety net contractually, what's called a default and cure clause. So you put them on notice, either side, the artist or the label is not complying with the terms of the agreement, and they usually have a period of time somewhere between 10 to 30 or even 60 days to cure it. So, for example, you're the artist, say, hey, I delivered the record, it's all ready to go. The record company sits on it, has an obligation to release, but they don't. You then send them a notice saying, hey, you haven't released it, you got 30 days to do that, or I terminate. So can that happen? Yes. Yeah. So that's where the label is not complying with the terms. But there's a common example where um, there's a default or a breach that may or may not be able to be cured, and maybe they don't want to cure. Maybe they go, great, okay, fine, send a notice, and you're out of the deal. So there's a couple of examples. I think that would be helpful.
Well, awesome. I think that will be the end to all of our questions. So, on the behalf of the Canadian Musicians Cooperative, we would like to thank you, Paul, for sharing your experience, knowledge, and resources. For anyone watching the live stream publicly, we have more public workshops planned during the summer, as well as our Barns to Beaches showcase tour. You can find more information on our website at www.canadianmusicians.coop. Thank you everyone for joining us, and thank you again to Paul for your presentation today.
Well,
Please,
thank you.
everybody, give Paul a hand, and thank you.
Yes, get where you negotiate. Get it in writing and check the facts. You'll be okay. It'll be good. Have some fun.
Okay, so I'm gonna pull you into a breakout room, so if we have any final words, we could talk about it, and I'll let Claire take over.
Thanks, Claire.